Hello everyone, myself Arvahita, Assistant Professor of CSE Department from Rohini College of Engineering and Technology. I am here to discuss a few topics of the subject CS 8592 Object Oriented Analysis and Design. Here we are going to discuss about the topic factory method, behavioral, strategy and observer patterns. Objective is to understand the basic concepts in the factory method, the behavioral pattern, strategy pattern and the observer pattern. Now let us see about the factory method pattern. A factory pattern or the factory method pattern says or defines an interface or abstract class for creating an object but lets the subclasses decide which class to instantiate. In other words, the subclasses are responsible to create the instance of the class. The factory method pattern is also known as the virtual constructor. Usage of factory design pattern. When a class doesn't know what subclasses will require to create, when a class wants that its subclasses specify the objects to be created, when the parent classes choose the creation of objects to its subclasses. Advantage of factory design pattern. The factory method pattern allows the subclasses to choose the type of objects to create. It promotes the loose coupling by eliminating the need to bind application specific classes into code. That means the code interfaces solely with a resultant interface or abstract class so that it will work with any class that implement the interface or that extends the abstract class. Let us see about behavioral pattern. The behavioral pattern, which describes algorithms, assignments of responsibilities and interaction between the objects. The behavioral class patterns use the inheritance to distribute behavior, and the behavioral pattern object pattern uses the composition. That means the implementation and the client should be loosely coupled in order to avoid the hard coding and dependencies. There are 12 types of behavioral design patterns: chain of responsibility pattern, command pattern, interpreter pattern, iterator pattern, mediator pattern, memento pattern, observer pattern, state pattern, strategy pattern, template pattern and visitor pattern. Let us see about chain of responsibilities. A way of passing a request between a chain of objects is called chain of responsibilities. Avoid coupling the sender of a request to its receiver by giving more than one object a chance to handle the request. Chain the receiving objects and pass the request along the chain until an object handles it. Command. Encapsulate a command request as an object. Encapsulate a request as an object, thereby letting you parameterized clients with different requests, queue or long requests, and support the operations. Interpreter, a way to include the language elements in a program which gives a language, define a representation for its grammar along with the interpreter that uses the representation to interpret the sentence in a language. About iterator, it is sequentially access the elements of the object, which provides a way to access the elements of the aggregate object sequentially without exposing its underlying representation. Mediator, which defines the simplified communication between classes, which defines an object that encapsulates how a set of objects interacts. Mediator promotes loose coupling by keeping objects from referring to each other explicitly, and it lets us vary the interaction independently. Memento, capture and restore an object's internal state. Without violating encapsulation, capture and externalize an object's internal state so that the object can be restored to its state later. About observer, a way of notifying the change to a number of classes which defines a one-to-many dependency between the objects so that when one object changes the state, all its dependents are notified and updated automatically. About state, it alters an object's behavior when its state changes. Allow an object to alter its behavior. When its internal state changes, the object will appear the state its class. Strategy. It encapsulates an algorithm inside a class, define a family of algorithms, encapsulates each one and make them interchangeable. The strategy lets the algorithm vary independently from the clients that use it. Template. It differs the exact steps of the algorithm to the subclass. Define the skeleton of an algorithm in an operation which differs some steps to subclasses. The template method lets the subclasses redefine certain steps of algorithm without changing the algorithm structure. About visitor, which defines a new operation to a class without changing and represents an operation to be performed on the elements of an object structure. Visitor, which lets us define a new operation without changing the classes of the elements on which it operates. Now let us know about strategy pattern. A strategy pattern, a class behavior or its algorithm can be changed at runtime. This type of design pattern comes under the behavioral pattern. In strategy pattern, we create the objects which represents various strategies and a context object whose behavior varies as per its strategy object. The strategy object changes the execution algorithm of the context object. Implementation. We are going to create a strategy interface defining an action and concrete strategy classes implementing the strategy interface. Context is a class which uses a strategy. So the strategy pattern demo is our demo class which will use the context and strategy objects to demonstrate change in context behavior based on strategy it deploys or uses. Now let us see about observer pattern. Observer pattern is used when there is one-to-many relationship between objects, such as if one object is modified, it's dependent on the objects to be notified automatically. Observer pattern falls under behavioral pattern category. Implementation. The observer pattern uses three actor classes: subject, observer, and client. Subject is an object which have methods to attach and detach the observers to a client object. We have created an abstract class observer and a concrete class subject which is extend class observer. Observer pattern demo or demo class will use the subject and concrete class object to show observer pattern in action. This is a diagram which shows the observer pattern demo, observer and the subject class. Thank you.